The Alien King's Belief. The Alien King sat in his grand throne room, a massive chamber filled with glowing holographic maps of star systems and planets under his rule. His empire stretched across thousands of worlds, each conquered with ease. As he looked over his domain, a smile crept across his face. He had never known defeat, never seen a race that could challenge his strength and power. His reign had lasted centuries, and his enemies had fallen one by one. But today, he was faced with a new challenge, one that was, in his mind, beneath him. The scouts had returned with their report. A tiny, insignificant planet called Earth, located on the edge of the galaxy. The humans who lived there were weak, primitive, and technologically inferior. They were nothing more than a minor nuisance. The king had heard whispers of this world before, but he had dismissed them as nothing more than rumors. The humans, they claimed, had spirit, but what good was spirit when faced with superior technology and overwhelming power? They're nothing, the king muttered to himself, shaking his head. An entire species of weaklings living in their ignorance. His advisors, who stood silently around him, exchanged worried glances. They knew better than to question their ruler, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even the most powerful empires in the galaxy had learned to respect humanity, and many had fallen to their ingenuity. But the king's pride was too great. He had seen hundreds of alien species bend the knee before him. The thought that something as small as Earth could pose a threat was laughable. With a wave of his hand, the king issued orders to send a fleet to Earth. "Bring me their leader," he commanded. "Let them see what happens when they stand in the way of my empire." His fleet, the most advanced in the galaxy, would land on Earth and easily overpower the humans. They would surrender or be crushed beneath his might. The king would give them one final chance to kneel before him. But if they refused, the punishment would be swift and merciless. He was sure of it. After all, how could a species so weak ever stand a chance? As the fleet departed, the king leaned back in his throne, confident that victory was assured. He spent the next several hours monitoring the progress of the invasion, his eyes fixed on the shimmering screens that displayed the movement of his ships. He was already imagining the look of terror on the faces of the humans as they realized they were no match for him. He imagined them begging for mercy, hoping to save their pitiful civilization from his wrath. But what the king didn't realize was that his own arrogance would be his downfall. He had failed to understand one simple truth. Humans, despite their weaknesses, had a fire inside them that no alien empire could extinguish. This was something the king had never encountered before. He had never been forced to fight for survival, never had to rely on anything other than brute force. The humans, on the other hand, were a species that fought for their very existence, no matter the odds. The first wave of the king's fleet arrived above Earth with little fanfare. The humans barely had time to react before the alien ships began their assault. The king watched from his command center, expecting a swift and easy victory. His ships unleashed devastating energy blasts, tearing through cities and military installations. The humans fought back with their primitive weapons, but it was clear to the king that they stood no chance. "They fight like ants," the king said, chuckling to himself. "This will be over in no time." But as the battle raged on, something unexpected began to happen. The humans didn't break. They didn't run. Instead, they fought back with an intensity that the king hadn't anticipated. Small, uncoordinated human resistance groups began to appear out of nowhere, using the terrain to their advantage. They launched surprise attacks on the alien fleet, causing unexpected losses. The king's fleet, which had been so confident in their superiority, began to falter. "Impossible," the king muttered under his breath. "How are they doing this?" His fleet, trained to crush entire civilizations, was struggling to keep up with the humans' tactics. The alien soldiers, with their advanced armor and weapons, were being outsmarted by human ingenuity. The king watched in disbelief as his forces were ambushed in the most unexpected ways. They were being picked off one by one, their technology outmatched by the humans' unpredictability. The king's pride began to waver. This was not supposed to happen. He had underestimated them. No, he had outright dismissed them. How could a species so small, so weak, put up such a fight? The thought of losing to these creatures was unbearable. But there was no turning back now. His fleet had been deployed, and the king's ego would not allow him to retreat. He gritted his teeth and issued another command. Increase the intensity of the attack. Destroy their cities, their resources, their will to fight. Show them the true power of my empire. Yet, even as the king gave his orders, a small, nagging feeling began to grow inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt a hint of doubt. Could it be possible that he had misjudged humanity? Could these weak humans have something that he could never understand? As his fleet continued the assault, the king couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The war had only just begun, and the alien king was about to realize that his arrogance had blinded him to a force greater than anything his empire could conquer. As the alien king watched from his command center, the battle above Earth raged on. His fleet had decimated entire cities, but something unusual was happening. Despite the overwhelming power of the invasion, the humans weren't panicking. Instead, they fought back with determination and strategy, something the king had not expected from a species so primitive. It started with small skirmishes, resistance groups appearing seemingly out of nowhere, attacking in places where the king's forces least expected. These humans weren't fighting with advanced weapons or alien technology, but with something far more dangerous: creativity and resolve. At first, the king had dismissed their resistance as nothing more than a nuisance. He had expected their military to crumble within hours. But as the days passed, the humans began to prove him wrong. The resistance spread like wildfire, becoming more organized and effective with each passing hour. Humans fought with a ferocity the king could not comprehend. "They're not running," the king muttered under his breath. "They should be terrified." His eyes scanned the holographic map that displayed the ongoing battle. He watched as human forces launched guerrilla attacks, ambushing alien patrols and sabotaging supply lines. Every time the king's fleet made an advance, the humans countered, using the terrain to their advantage, hiding in places where his fleet could not reach them. The king's officers were growing increasingly frustrated. "We've lost several ships to their traps, Your Majesty," one of them reported nervously. "Their forces are more coordinated than we thought. They're not just fighting, they're thinking." The king's face hardened. He had been told stories of human ingenuity, but he had never truly believed them. To him, the humans were nothing more than a fleeting problem, an insignificant race to crush and move on. But now he saw their determination firsthand. They were not giving up. And with each victory, the king's pride was chipped away just a little more. The king slammed his fist onto his throne. "We will crush them," he growled. "All of them. Every last one." He commanded his fleet to take more aggressive action, sending out waves of ships to bombard key locations, to break the spirit of the humans. But even as he issued the order, he felt a sense of unease. Something about the way the humans fought made him hesitate, just for a moment. Back on Earth, the human resistance was growing stronger. People from all walks of life had joined the fight. Soldiers, scientists, engineers, civilians. Everyone had a role to play. The streets, once filled with chaos and fear, had become centers of defiance. Humans were using their limited resources in ways the king could never have predicted. Every bomb, every weapon, every plan was crafted with the intent to outsmart and outlast the alien invaders. One group of resistance fighters, a ragtag team of engineers and former military personnel, had successfully captured an alien ship. They studied it for days, analyzing its technology, its weaknesses. Using their understanding of the ship's systems, they began crafting makeshift weapons designed to disable the alien fleet's most powerful ships. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back and showing the king that humans were not as weak as he believed. They were not just fighting for their homes. They were fighting for their very existence. Meanwhile, In the skies above, the king watched as his fleet encountered more setbacks. What had once seemed like an easy victory was now dragging into a full-scale war. His ships were being damaged, his forces stretched thin. It was clear that the humans had no intention of surrendering. "They're not just fighting to survive," the king said, his voice growing colder. "They're fighting for something more." But what? What drives them? His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the humans' resilience. He had faced countless enemies in his long reign, but none had fought with such determination. The humans, with their primitive technology, were making a mockery of his superior fleet. He had never felt such frustration in his life. Days turned into weeks, and the war showed no sign of ending. The king's fleet was in disarray, and the humans were not backing down. What had started as a small rebellion was now a full-scale war, with every human on Earth playing a part. The king could no longer deny the truth. These weak humans were a force to be reckoned with. In the heart of the battle, the humans were beginning to push back. The king's ships were slowly being driven from their positions, and the human resistance was starting to take control of key strategic points. It was becoming clear that the alien king's belief that humans were nothing more than insignificant creatures was a dangerous mistake. The king's pride was shattered, and his arrogance had led him into a war he had never expected to fight. As he looked out over the battlefield, he could no longer deny the truth. The humans were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove a point. And that point was simple: never underestimate them. But the king wasn't ready to give up just yet. He had underestimated the humans, yes, but he was not a ruler who backed down easily. If there was one thing he knew, it was that there was always a way to win, and he was about to find out just how far the humans were willing to go to protect their world. The war was far from over, but the first seeds of doubt had been planted in the king's mind. He had always believed that victory was guaranteed, that no species could stand against his power. But the humans were proving him wrong. They were showing him that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they would never give up. And that, the king realized, was a lesson he would never forget. The war raged on, and the once unstoppable force of the alien king's fleet was beginning to falter. Despite their technological superiority, the humans had begun to develop tactics that exploited the very weaknesses the king had dismissed as irrelevant. Now the king had no choice but to admit the truth. His underestimation of humanity was turning out to be a catastrophic mistake. One of the key turning points in the war came when a group of human engineers managed to reverse engineer the technology from one of the king's ships they had captured. The ship, originally designed to be a weapon of mass destruction, had been one of the most feared crafts in the king's arsenal. However, through sheer ingenuity, the humans had not only learned to control it, but they had also turned it into a powerful weapon of their own. The first time the humans unleashed the captured alien ship on the battlefield, it was nothing short of miraculous. The king's fleet, which had been dominating the skies, suddenly found itself outmatched. The ship's advanced weaponry, combined with human strategy, gave the resistance a significant advantage. In the midst of this chaos, the king's officers grew increasingly uneasy. "Your Majesty, the human resistance has begun using our own ships against us," one of his top commanders reported. "They've adapted our technology faster than we anticipated. If this continues, we could lose the entire fleet." The king's grip tightened around the armrests of his throne. His eyes narrowed in frustration. "This cannot be happening. How can they use our own technology against us?" His voice was cold, filled with disbelief. His officers, some of whom had been with him for decades, exchanged uneasy glances. The alien king had always prided himself on his intellect and strategic brilliance, but now his arrogance had clouded his judgment. He had failed to see the potential of humanity, and now they were using his own strength against him. Meanwhile, on Earth, the humans were starting to feel a sense of hope they hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since the invasion began, they were fighting on equal terms. The tide was turning and victory seemed within their grasp. But the cost of the war was taking its toll. Cities had been reduced to rubble, millions of lives lost, and resources were dwindling. Yet the humans pressed on, determined to end the conflict once and for all. In the heart of the resistance, a group of human leaders had gathered to plan the next stage of their offensive. They knew that while they had the advantage, the king would not go down without a fight. His arrogance was legendary, and if the war was to end, they would have to deal with him directly. "We can't keep up this fight forever," one of the resistance commanders said, his voice grim. "We need to strike at the heart of the king's fleet, and we need to do it soon. If we don't, he'll find a way to turn the tables." The humans were preparing for their most daring mission yet, an all-out assault on the king's flagship, a massive craft that housed his command center and served as the symbol of his power. It was heavily guarded, nearly impenetrable, and located in the heart of the enemy's territory. But the humans were desperate, and they knew that if they didn't act quickly, the king would crush them once and for all. As they made their final preparations, the tension was palpable. The humans knew the risks. They were walking straight into the lion's den. But they had no other choice. It was do or die. And they would do whatever it took to protect their world. Back on the king's flagship, the alien king was growing more desperate. The setbacks had taken their toll on his confidence. He had lost dozens of ships, and the humans were proving to be far more resourceful than he had ever imagined. His once great empire was crumbling under the weight of their resistance. The king sat in his throne room, staring at the vast display in front of him. He watched as his fleet continued to struggle against the humans' relentless assault. His eyes narrowed as he saw one of his top commanders approach. "Your Majesty," the commander said hesitantly, "the human resistance is organizing a large-scale assault. They're coming for us. We believe they're planning to attack the flagship." The king's lips curled into a wicked smile. "Let them come. Let them think they have a chance. They will regret ever defying me." But deep down, even the king couldn't shake the feeling that this time the humans might have a chance. The resistance had done the unthinkable, had turned the tide of the war. And now, they were coming for him. As the human forces prepared for their bold assault, they had no idea that the alien king, too, was preparing his final move. The war had become personal. It was no longer about territories or empires. It was about survival. The king was determined to crush humanity once and for all, to prove that no species could stand against his power. But the humans were no longer the weak, defenseless creatures he had once thought them to be. They were now the greatest threat to his empire, and the king would do anything to stop them. The stage was set for a final showdown, one that would determine the fate of Earth, of humanity, and of the alien king himself. The final battle had begun. The time for waiting was over. As the humans readied their forces for the assault on the alien king's flagship, the air was thick with anticipation. The resistance fighters, though battle-worn and weary, had no choice but to push forward. They knew that this would be their one shot to end the war, to free their world, and to show the king just how wrong he had been about them. The humans had gathered their forces, fighters, bombers, engineers, and scientists, all working together to orchestrate an attack that would shake the very foundations of the alien king's empire. They had spent weeks planning, analyzing every weakness in the king's flagship defenses, and now they were ready to strike. The fleet began to move, making its way through the vast expanse of space, each ship poised for the biggest mission of their lives. The moment was electric with tension as the resistance fighters closed in on the flagship's location. On the king's flagship, the alien king sat in his throne room, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. He had been prepared for this. The humans were predictable after all. He had seen their tactics before, and he knew they would try to hit his flagship. But he had built his flagship to be impenetrable, fortified with layers of defenses that no enemy could breach. He had no fear. "Commander, prepare the fleet. Let the humans come. We shall crush them," the king said, his voice cold and filled with arrogance. "Yes, Your Majesty," replied his most trusted officer, who had been by his side throughout the entire campaign. The officer's voice trembled slightly, but the king didn't notice. He was too sure of himself. Meanwhile, on the human side, the fleet was nearing its target. The commanders exchanged determined glances. They knew the risks. They knew that the king would not give up without a fight. But they had come too far to back down now. They were ready to give everything for their world, for their families, for their freedom. "We're almost there," said one of the human pilots, his voice crackling over the comms. "Prepare for the first wave. Target the outer defenses." The flagship loomed ahead, a massive structure of steel and alien technology. It seemed invincible, its shields flickering with a cold, unnatural glow. The human fleet unleashed its first wave, fighters and bombers that zoomed forward at breakneck speed. Their weapons fired in perfect unison, aiming for the weak points in the king's defenses. The king watched from his command center as the first wave of human ships launched their attack. He couldn't help but smirk. "Fools," he muttered under his breath. "They think they can breach my fortress. Let them try." But as the humans' bombs exploded on impact, a sudden realization began to creep into the king's mind. The human fleet was organized, more efficient than ever before. The aliens they had captured and turned into allies were helping them understand the alien tech, and the humans were adapting faster than he could have anticipated. The explosions were having an effect. Shields were weakening, and some of the exterior defenses were beginning to fail. "Impossible," the king shouted, his voice rising in anger. "How are they doing this? What is happening?" The officer beside him hesitated but then spoke. "Your Majesty, we believe they've managed to analyze our shields and are using their own technology to exploit the weaknesses. Their adaptability is beyond anything we've encountered before." The king's confidence began to falter. His throne, once a symbol of unshakable power, suddenly felt too small for him. His grip tightened around the armrests as he watched his mighty flagship being attacked, its once invincible defenses faltering against the humans' relentless assault. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the humans were pushing forward. The first wave had made a dent, but now they needed to breach the inner sanctum of the flagship, where the king's command center lay. They could not afford to waste any time. The king's fleet was still strong, and reinforcements would soon arrive. "Team Bravo, move in," one of the human commanders ordered. "We've got one shot at this. Once we're in, we go straight for the heart." As the human forces closed in on the flagship, the tension was palpable. Every fighter, every ship, every soldier knew that their lives were on the line. But they also knew that this was their moment. The moment they would either crush the alien king's reign or die trying. Inside the flagship, the king's officers were scrambling. The once pristine control room was now filled with alarms and flashing red lights. "The outer shields are down, Your Majesty." "They're moving in closer," one officer reported, panic creeping into his voice. The king's face twisted in rage. "No, this is unacceptable. We are the most powerful species in the galaxy." But the humans were proving him wrong. Slowly, but surely, they were breaking through. The alien king had underestimated them for too long, and now his empire was on the brink of collapse. With the flagship's outer defenses breached, the humans were preparing for the final push. They had to get to the king himself, the source of all the destruction and chaos. The mission had become personal, and nothing would stop them now. The battle for the future of humanity had reached its climax, and the king could only watch, helpless, as the humans closed in on him. The assault on the flagship was now in full swing, and the humans were determined to win at all costs. The king's empire, once seen as invincible, was crumbling. But as the humans advanced toward their goal, they knew the most dangerous part of the mission was yet to come: the confrontation with the alien king himself. The stage was set for a final, epic showdown that would decide the fate of not only the human race, but the entire galaxy. The human assault on the alien king's flagship had escalated to unprecedented levels. The once proud defenses were collapsing, and the resistance fighters were pushing forward with everything they had. As the humans advanced, it became clear to the king that this was no ordinary rebellion. The resistance was different, organized, relentless, and far more capable than anything he had imagined. The king sat in his throne room, staring at the holographic display in front of him, his mind racing. He had expected this to be a minor inconvenience, an easy victory that would solidify his empire's dominance. Instead, he was now witnessing the beginning of the end of his reign. His fingers dug into the armrests of his throne, his knuckles white with tension. How did this happen? The king muttered to himself, his voice filled with disbelief. How did these humans manage to break through? The officer beside him, who had been watching the battle unfold, hesitated for a moment before speaking. Your Majesty, we underestimated them. Their ingenuity, their adaptability. It's unlike anything we've encountered. They found weaknesses in our technology and exploited them in ways we never imagined. The king's mind raced as the truth began to sink in. The humans had shown him something he hadn't believed was possible, the ability to fight, adapt, and win against overwhelming odds. In his arrogance, he had written them off as weak, primitive creatures. But now, those very creatures were tearing apart his empire. He slammed his fist onto the armrest in frustration. No, I will not be defeated by them. Not by these insignificant beings. We are the masters of the galaxy. But deep down, even the king couldn't deny the fear creeping into his heart. The humans were not the weak, helpless species he had thought them to be. They were strong, resourceful, and now they were at his doorstep. His empire, once thought invincible, was crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the human forces were closing in. The flagship's inner defenses were weakening, and the human commandos had breached the main structure. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the king's power. The command center. It was a race against time. The king had underestimated the humans for far too long, and now they were here to prove that his belief in their weakness was his greatest mistake. The tension in the air was thick. The human forces moved with precision, using their knowledge of the flagship's systems to disable key security measures. They were getting closer to their goal, closer to the alien king himself. The officers aboard the flagship were panicking, their once confident faces now etched with fear. Commander, they're almost here. We need to do something. We can't let them reach the throne room. One officer shouted, his voice shaky with fear. The commander of the flagship's defense forces stood, her posture stiff with determination, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. Prepare for the final defense, she ordered. We're not letting them take the king. As the human forces advanced, the king's fear grew. He had thought he could crush the rebellion with ease, but now he realized how wrong he had been. His empire was on the brink of collapse, and the humans were the ones pushing it over the edge. With every passing minute, the king's regret deepened. He had thought himself untouchable, that no one, not even the humans, could challenge him. But now, faced with the reality of the humans' unstoppable march, he could only watch as his power slipped through his fingers. The very creatures he had disrespected were about to bring him to his knees. Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the flagship, signaling the final stage of the attack. The human forces had reached the heart of the flagship. The king's officers scrambled, desperately trying to secure the throne room, but it was too late. The humans had already breached the outer chambers. The king stood from his throne, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. He had been arrogant, foolish, and now he was paying the price. The humans were not just a threat. They were his reckoning. He had laughed at their weakness. But now, as they closed in on him, he understood the true meaning of powerlessness. I have to get out of here, the king muttered to himself, his voice trembling. I have to survive. But even as he turned to flee, he knew it was too late. The humans were coming, and there would be no escape. His empire, built on the backs of fear and oppression, was about to crumble. and in the end, it would be his own arrogance that would lead to his downfall. Meanwhile, the humans were on the verge of victory. The king's once imposing fortress was now nothing more than a crumbling relic, and the resistance fighters were closing in on their final target. They had fought long and hard for this moment, and they would not let it slip through their fingers. The king's time had come, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the human commandos reached the throne room, the king realized the true cost of his actions. His empire, his arrogance, and his disregard for the humans had all led to this moment, and now he would have to face the consequences. The king had laughed at the humans' weakness. Now he would be forced to live with the regret of underestimating them. The alien king's heart pounded in his chest as the last vestiges of his empire crumbled. His once mighty forces, scattered and disorganized, were no match for the relentless human assault. His flagship, once an impenetrable fortress, now felt like a sinking ship, its corridors filled with the echoes of gunfire and the screams of defeated soldiers. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the weight of his past arrogance and pride was pulling him down. The king's thoughts raced. He had made countless mistakes, but the worst of them had been underestimating the humans. He had never believed they could reach this point, never thought they could challenge his superiority. Now, as he sprinted down the darkened hallways of his flagship, he understood the true cost of his arrogance. In the chaos of the battle, the king had ordered his personal guards to hold off the humans while he made his way to a secure escape pod. His plan was to flee the ship, to survive and regroup, but the closer he got to the escape route, the more desperate the situation became. The human forces were everywhere, sweeping through the ship with surgical precision, cutting down any resistance in their path. "Your Majesty, we've lost control of the outer sectors," one of his officers reported, his voice shaking with fear. "The humans are everywhere. We cannot hold them back any longer." The king's eyes blazed with fury as he snapped back, "We will not surrender. I will not be defeated by these." He stopped himself, the words feeling hollow now. The enemy wasn't just a few rebels or outcasts. These were humans, fierce, determined, and ready to fight until the last breath. They weren't going to stop, and the king knew it. The once proud alien leader's mind was now filled with doubt. His forces had failed him, and his pride had been shattered. But there was one thing he still had: his escape. If he could just make it to the pod, he could escape this disaster. His empire may be collapsing, but his life could still be spared. But as he rounded the corner toward the escape bay, he froze. The door was already ajar, the telltale signs of a breach in the system unmistakable. The escape pod was gone. In its place was the symbol of humanity's triumph, a human flag, draped over the controls, the colors boldly representing the victory they had earned. The king's blood ran cold. His worst fear had been realized. There was no escape. From the shadows, a voice cut through the silence. "I thought you were smarter than this, Your Majesty." The king whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the leader of the human resistance. The same leader who had been a thorn in his side throughout the conflict, the one who had shown no fear in the face of the king's most formidable forces. The human had a look of quiet satisfaction on their face, but there was no malice, only a sense of cold, calculated victory. The king's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan, but he knew there was no way out. He had underestimated the humans from the beginning, and now it had come to this. His empire was gone, his forces shattered, and now his life was in the hands of the very species he had once scorned. "You," the king's voice was hoarse, filled with a mix of rage and desperation. "You will regret this. I will have my revenge. My people will rise again. You cannot defeat us all." The human leader stepped forward, their face unwavering, their voice calm. "We don't want revenge, Your Majesty. We don't want to see your people destroyed. But your arrogance, your cruelty, it all ends here. The universe will not tolerate such tyranny." For a moment, the king considered launching a final attack, using his remaining strength to destroy the human leader. But he realized that it was futile. The humans had already won, and there was nothing left for him to fight for. Instead, he stood there in stunned silence, his anger giving way to a deep, gnawing regret. He had believed himself invincible, but now he saw the truth. The humans had outsmarted him at every turn. They had taken down his empire, broken his power, and now they were standing in front of him as the victors. In that moment, the king realized the full weight of his mistake. The humans weren't weak. They weren't helpless. They had the strength, the will, and the intelligence to rise up, even against the most powerful empire in the galaxy. And he had been blind to that truth until it was too late. The human leader stepped closer, offering a final, measured look. Your reign ends here. The galaxy will remember you, not as a conqueror, but as a fool who couldn't see the strength of those he considered beneath him. The king's shoulders slumped. He had lived for power, for control. But now, as the last of his empire faded away, all he had left was regret. There would be no more armies, no more planets to conquer. His empire had fallen, and it was the humans who had brought him to this point. As the human leader turned to leave, the king was left standing there, surrounded by the remnants of his failed empire. His empire that had once seemed so invincible, now reduced to dust. He had disrespected the humans, and now he would live to see his mistake, a mistake that had cost him everything. And in that moment, as the sound of retreating footsteps echoed in the distance, the king finally understood. It was not the humans who were weak. It had never been them. It was him. His arrogance, his pride, had led to his downfall. The humans had proven, once and for all, that they were not to be underestimated. It was the end of the king's reign, and the beginning of a new era, one where humanity would rise as the true power of the galaxy. The cold metal walls of the flagship had once felt like a fortress, an impenetrable barrier between the alien king and the rest of the universe. Now, as he stood amidst the wreckage of his empire, the walls felt suffocating. The king had no power, no soldiers left to command, and no path forward. His final desperate escape attempt had failed, and all that remained was the reality of his defeat. The human leader, standing calmly before him, had not once wavered in their resolve. The king, his once mighty armor now a symbol of his fall from grace, was left vulnerable, stripped of his illusions. He had believed that his species was superior to the humans, that their technology, their strength, their very nature made them invincible. But now, as he faced the leader of the resistance, he could see the truth. The humans had not only defeated him, they had humiliated him. The silence in the air was thick, filled with the weight of the king's regrets. His mind replayed every decision. Every moment he had dismissed the humans as weak, as beneath him. He had underestimated them in every possible way. And now he was left to pay the price. You were right, the king said, his voice barely above a whisper. His words, though reluctant, were the only thing left for him to offer. I was wrong. The human leader gave a nod, their expression unreadable. We warned you. The galaxy isn't as it was before. Your kind believed you were untouchable, but it was always about more than just strength. It was about respect, and you chose to disrespect the humans. The king's head hung low. His once proud empire had crumbled, and the few remaining loyalists were scattered, unable to even offer a token resistance. His arrogance had blinded him to the simple truth that the humans had something his empire lacked: unity, determination, and the will to fight for what was right. They had faced seemingly impossible odds, but they had never wavered. I never saw it. I thought you were weak, primitive, the king continued, his voice laced with the bitter taste of realization. But now, I see how foolish I was. The human leader took a step closer, their voice firm but not unkind. It's not too late to change, Your Majesty. You may have lost everything, but you can still live with honor. There's no more fighting, no more conquering. The universe will remember your name, not for your power, but for the lesson you learned too late. The king's chest tightened. Honor. Was there still honor in his shattered existence? He had led with fear and strength, believing that those who bowed before him were loyal. But loyalty, he had learned, could not be bought with force. True loyalty was born of respect and understanding, two things he had never given to the humans. Honor. The king whispered the word, as though testing its weight. I never thought of it like that. You should have, the human leader replied. But it's not too late. We're offering you the chance to live differently. You can rebuild, not through power, but through wisdom. For the first time in a long while, the king felt a flicker of something other than rage or pride. It was hope. A small, fragile thing, but it was there. He had lost everything. His empire, his power, his soldiers. But in this moment, facing a future where the universe was no longer his to command, there was still something to be salvaged. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life. Not as a king, but as someone who had learned the true meaning of strength. The king raised his head, meeting the human leader's gaze. And if I choose to go along with your offer? The human leader gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then you'll learn what it means to lead with honor, not fear, and we'll help you. But you must understand that we're not doing this because you're special. We're doing it because every being in the galaxy deserves a second chance. The king's heart felt heavy, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from the weight of his crown. It was the weight of the lesson he had learned, the lesson that had cost him everything. He had been a fool, but perhaps if he was wise enough now, he could rise again. Not as the king he once was, but as something greater. He nodded slowly. I will accept your offer. I will learn, and I will honor the humans. The human leader stepped back, their expression softening. Then we have no more to discuss. You've learned what so many others have failed to learn. Let's rebuild together. And with that, the king, stripped of his title, but not his potential, stepped into the unknown future. He had fallen from the heights of arrogance, but now, for the first time, he felt the possibility of redemption. His reign was over, but his journey was just beginning. And this time, he would walk it with humility and respect for the very species he had once tried to conquer. As he left the wreckage of his empire behind, the king finally understood what the humans had known all along. True strength wasn't about domination. It wasn't about fear or power. It was about the courage to admit when you were wrong, to change, and to grow. And in that moment, the king realized that his most important battle had not been fought with weapons, but with himself. The humans had taught him that lesson, and that was something no empire, no matter how mighty, could ever take away.